are, I'd like to let people know that we are one member short of a quorum. So we are going to get started with public comment, with some discussion issues, and we are going to defer any items that require a vote until such time as we can achieve quorum. So what I would like to start out is to request a roll call so we can at least establish who's here now, and then we can add those who attend later.
Will do. Barahona,
Present.
Buenaventura, Chen, Huser,
Present.
Stevens, Tony.
Present.
Quorum is not established.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'd like to go to public comment because I don't want to make people wait who have wanted to address the audit committee and I'm sure have been on since 11 or before. So, if you are on Zoom, there's a raise your hand function at the bottom. If you're on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. And if you're in a noticed location, please alert the State Bar staff or board member present to let them know that you want to make comment. So do we have people that are signed up now?
And we have 2 members of the public who have signed up in advance. Our first speaker with phone number ending in 6757. If you could please raise your hand for me to identify you. No phone numbers are appearing in the attendee list. I will give you 10 more seconds. Okay. The second member of the public that signed up in advance did not provide the last 4 digits of their phone number nor their name. So if you could please raise your hand right now, you'll be unmuted. No one has raised their hand, so that concludes public comment for those who signed up in advance.
Okay. Well, if anybody is on and would like to present public comment who didn't sign up ahead of time, let us know. Raise your hand on Zoom, raise your hand on the phone, tap somebody on the shoulder if you're at a place in person, and we'll be happy to give you 3 minutes. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I can get started with the oral report. Doesn't require a quorum. The Audit Committee Working Group, which consists of myself and Trustee Stevens, we met on May 2nd to discuss the upcoming independent financial report, financial audit requests for proposal. We met with Chief Financial Officer at Araceli Montoya Chico, and the purpose of the RFP is to allow the State Bar to have an open process to select the best qualified firm to conduct upcoming financial audits for the State Bar. The committee reviewed draft RFP, that's request for proposal documents. And later this week, the State Bar plans to publicly release the request for proposal. And it'll be going out and, made accessible to the public. So that's my main report. I do think we're going to have to defer taking up the minutes of the last meeting because that requires a quorum. And we will also have to defer consent and I'm just trying to see where we can go. I'm wondering if we can start with the overview of state bar procurement disparity studies. It does not appear that that requires a vote.
I think that should be fine, but I want to check with Aline that that's fine.
There's no action item presented. This is a or requested of the audit committee, so you can receive the report and presentation from staff.
Thank you.
So we've promoted the two presenters, Chief Administrative Officer Steve Mazur and Mike Diaz.
Welcome.
Hi, could you please also promote Amy Nunez and Raul Duran? They will be available for answering questions if necessary.
One moment.
Wait for them.
I do not see Nunez in the attendee pool.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Steve Mazur here, Chief Administrative Officer. General Services, which oversees procurement, reports up to me. So with us here is Maite Diaz, the Director of General Services. Some of you have met her before. Maite and I are going to provide a brief overview of the assessment findings and what steps we've already been or have already been implemented or are in progress. Then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So I'll get us started. Rosales Law Partners is a public policy and civil rights firm with expertise in DEI policy in the public sector. The bar engaged them to assess our procurement policies and procedures and to make recommendations to help us further our strategic plan commitment to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in the bar's own operations, as well as in the legal profession. That report was posted in advance for you to review. So Rosales looked at procurement generally and then specifically at admissions, where we do have a specific strategic plan objective of continuing to diversify the exam development and grading pool. In the past, DER considerations were admittedly not at the forefront of procurement activities, as we've been largely focused on compliance with competitive bidding and other requirements. But now we are very excited to be on a path of incorporating DEI into one of the bar's really important core operations. In doing that, we're working within a legal framework, in particular Proposition 209, which was a 1996 amendment to the California Constitution. Prop 209 prohibits public contracting policies or practices that provide preferences to vendors based on race or gender. But Prop 209 does permit outreach efforts designed to broaden the pool of potential vendors without reliance on race or gender. And Rosales has suggested that this could be effectuated for us with a race and gender neutral procurement policy that encourages the participation of small businesses, which would naturally include diverse businesses owned by women and minorities. Prop 209 also permits collecting and reporting data concerning the participation of women and minorities in procurement in order to evaluate the effectiveness of our outreach efforts. So the activities that are permissible under Prop 209 provides us our path forward. So Maite, I'm going to turn over to Maite now to tell you about the report findings and what we are already doing.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, so the assessment basically stated two main issues. One, that we have not had policies or procedures to proactively encourage small and diverse vendors to participate in procurement opportunities. And two, that we have not been collecting any demographic data about vendors. And that's true. And as Steve said, that's because this was not an area of focus in the past, but it is now. So as part of the assessment, Rosales looked at all our contracts over a 3-year period and conducted a survey to collect information voluntarily from the more than 400 vendors with whom we did business during the review period. And interestingly, the survey showed that about 80% of the sample would meet the California Department of General Services definition for small or micro businesses, based on the company's revenue and size, which is the number of employees. The report also stated, and I'm reading directly from it, that the bar lacks a centralized procurement system, which hinders its ability to implement race, gender-neutral procurement measures. And I think this deserves a little bit of clarification, because we do have a centralized procurement function with dedicated staff, and they do procurement and administration, the compliance function of procurement. We also have a centralized IT system for procurement, and that's the Oracle Supply Chain Management module, which is part of our larger Oracle system for all HR and finance systems. Now, what we don't have is a centralized function for sourcing vendors. This is the function that is currently decentralized at the bar. And the reason is that the procurement unit does not have the resources or the expertise to independently identify and do outreach to the appropriate pool of vendors for every instance of procurement for 19 different state bar offices that procure a wide variety of oftentimes quite specialized goods and services. And just for a bit of context of the volume that we are dealing with, we process around 700 to 800 purchase orders on a yearly basis. So you can imagine how burdensome this would be. So this is really the primary reason why outreach to vendors has not always been extensive enough to reach a larger pool of small and diverse vendors. But we have a plan, and we think it's a good one. So now I'm going to tell you about some important changes that we have already implemented after the report was issued, and some of the changes that are currently in progress. So first, we have now added a small business enterprise program to the procurement policy, and we have modeled it after the policy that the California Department of General Services uses. And the goal is to achieve 25% procurement participation for small and micro businesses. In order to achieve this, it provides 5% bid preference, and it's capped at $50,000 to certified small or micro businesses. What it means is that the lowest bid, when it comes from a non-small business, will result in a 5% bid price being deducted from all the small businesses, all their proposals that they submit. And this is just for the purpose of evaluating the bids. To be considered small business, the vendor must have a small business certification from the California Department of General Services, or they can also have a comparable certification from a California municipality. Now, the second change we have implemented is the collection and the recording of vendor data. We have already configured Oracle to record if a vendor is a certified small business. That's already taken care of. And now we're working on the appropriate procedure and the technical configuration of Oracle, so we can collect voluntary demographic data to capture all this information. And third, to address the challenge of outreach to a larger pool of small business vendors, we are creating a new position in the procurement unit that will be dedicated to vendor sourcing. And of course, this is not a move towards a complete centralization of vendor sourcing, since that just isn't feasible with the resources that we have. But this new position will provide significant additional support to all the procuring offices at the bar. It will also develop expertise in broader sourcing methods and venues available, and it will also be paying close attention to outreach of a broad and diverse pool of vendors in a way that we haven't been able to do in the past. So we view this as a very important, positive, and meaningful step in furthering our DEI goals in procurement that also acknowledges the reality that we deal with our limited resources. So we will be looking at other important things that are noted in our report, but we think that these three main things will get us a lot closer to where we want to be, and we believe this will have the most impact. And that's pretty much the summary, and I'll turn it back to Steve for a moment.
Sure. I'll just touch briefly on the admissions section of the report. There is a strategic plan objective of increasing the diversity of the bar exam development and greater pool. By the time of the Rosales study, admissions had already increased outreach to affinity bar associations to solicit for graders, and had switched from in-person to virtual meetings for orientation, calibration, and check-in meetings, which really increased opportunities for participation. So the assessment reported that these race and gender neutral outreach efforts have already resulted in the inclusion of attorneys from diverse backgrounds to serve as graders, with 45% being people of color. Admissions has other initiatives in progress, including developing a social media, a wider social media campaign for graders, examining methods and practices of other state bars. They're also putting a plan together to increase diversity on the bar exam development side in addition to graders. So very briefly, that's where we stand right now, and happy to open it up for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Trustees, I'm going to turn to you, Trustee Huser, Trustee Barahona. What questions you might have?
I have one question. It sounds like we're taking the steps in the right direction, so thank you so much for all of your work. My question is, has there been a consideration, and this is just a process question that I'd love to understand, which is, could you release an RFQ annually that could then sort of gather all of the details that you're looking for, so that it's kind of a little bit more central, but I realize that there's a level of specialties in the procurement process, but I know that many, as an organization that often will complete an RFQ to be considered a vendor and complete all this information, and it's done in a dedicated sort of annual process, that might be helpful. That may or may not be what you're doing already. Just a question for you all.
Sure. I would think we don't currently do that generally, but it's certainly something we could do for those kinds of procurements that are known and recurring kinds of services that we do all the time. And that does tie in. There's another recommendation in the report, which we do want to look into, of establishing kind of a vendor portal where people could register in advance with us. Much larger organizations have things like that. You know, we haven't really seen ourselves quite at that level, but it's certainly something sort of in parallel with your suggestion that we'd be interested in and certainly looking into, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the response. I want to make sure I give Trustee Huser the opportunity to ask any questions if you wish.
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to say, I am very pleased. I got a little bit of a preview of this report in one of the meetings I had in between meetings from the person doing the study, and I was very impressed. And what I particularly like is the clarity in which you've identified some of the missing parts in the past when it comes to procurement, and to be able to both assess the diversity and to work to increase the diversity of the pool, and that you've come up with recommendations that I think make a lot of sense. Certainly ask you to, give some consideration to the recommendation that Trustee Barahona has made, just to see if there's a way to implement some of that. But I really don't have any further questions. I think you're on the right track, and your team has great clarity of vision, and you got a strategy. So I think that sounds pretty good.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are very excited about this. Procurement is kind of a, boring back office type of thing, but it's really important. And to be able to sort of integrate it now into this much bigger DEI initiative is really very exciting for us. So we're happy to get moving on it.
Well, that's great. I know there are people that think that audits are boring, and I love the audit committee and what we do, and I just really enjoy audits in general. So it's always good to have people working on something who are motivated and excited. So thank you very much.
I think, Trustee Tony, we could take Elizabeth's update on the 2201 program. That's also not an action item.
That would be great. Thank you for that guidance, Leah. And that would be completely appropriate. So if we can get the update on Rule 2201 and Form 700 compliance efforts, I'd sure appreciate it.
Sure. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, just fine.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to briefly provide an update on the State Bar's continued compliance efforts related to conflict of interest disclosures. So at the State Bar, conflict of interest disclosures include those outlined and documented in the State Bar's conflict of interest codes. That is the State Bar conflict of interest code for designated employees, as well as the code for a board of trustees. In addition, Rule 2201 of the State Bar Rules of Procedure provides that the Chief Trial Counsel must recuse OCTC in certain circumstances, which are outlined in the agenda item. So in 2023, the State Bar identified a need to clarify, formalize, and document responsibilities related to monitoring the conflict of interest disclosure compliance. In recent years, the State Bar has made many strides in improving compliance with disclosures and reporting those statistics publicly. But there was a need to really formalize the roles and responsibilities and know who's doing what. So the agenda item provides a brief background on the efforts that have been going on since late 2023. I'll start with the State Bar Rule of Procedure, Rule 2201. So to accurately assess the need to create firewalls or to recuse OCTC in instances where there may be a conflict, an actual or potential conflict of interest, the State Bar maintains a Rule 2201 conflict of interest database. And organizational compliance with Rule 2201 encompasses two main aspects. First, ensuring that designated individuals are added to the Rule 2201 conflict of interest database, and then ensuring that other designated individuals timely complete a Rule 2201 questionnaire. So there are a couple different offices that were involved in this effort. OGC issued a memo clarifying the classifications of individuals who either needed to be entered into the database beyond those who were already in our internal database, or complete a questionnaire disclosing relationships with California licensed attorneys. So as a result, additional State Bar attorney contractors were contacted by the State Bar in order to complete their disclosures. On the internal side, there were some additional fields added into our central database for tracking contractors to ensure that contractors both now and in the future are able to complete those questionnaires as part of their contract execution. There were some trainings that were conducted for sub-entity members that covered their conflict of interest reporting if required under Rule 2201. And then the Office of Compliance issued a policy related to entering, managing, and reporting data on Rule 2201 conflicts. So as of the end of last month, I'm happy to report that approximately 95% of those who are required to make disclosures or be entered into this conflict of interest database, 95% of all across the State Bar have completed those disclosures. And then moving forward, the questionnaires and then the updates will be required at the end of the year in December annually. Next, I'll touch briefly on Form 700, the Statement of Economic Interest. So that filing data is managed through NetFile, which is an external application that various staff at the State Bar have access to in order to manage the submissions of those disclosure statements. The Office of General Counsel has finalized a Form 700 process manual that clarifies the responsibilities of filing officers and answers many questions that staff or others might have about the designated positions, disclosure categories, and our notification requirements for filing. Additional trainings were conducted, as you all also participated in as Board of Trustees members earlier this year. Again, for our central tracking of contractors who are required to make disclosures related to Form 700, we made updates to our Oracle tracking system, and there will be additional documents that will be forthcoming about that process manual and things like that. So as of April 30th, the overall completion rate for annual statements that were due in 2024 is 99%, and of those statements, 98% were timely filed. So overall, the processes and procedures that were formalized in 2024 are intended to minimize duplication of work across offices, document clear roles and responsibilities, and decrease the likelihood that actual or potential conflicts of interest go unreported. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that very clear and succinct summary. I'm going to open it up to questions from our trustees.
I have one question. is there any way to mandate this form? And I don't know if General Counsel or Elizabeth, what your thoughts are on that, given the importance of both of the forms and given, just given the critical importance, is there a way to mandate and or pause somebody's participation in some way, shape, or form until that form is completed?
Sure, so I can start and then I would ask Aline to jump in where needed. So the Political Reform Act that the State Bar adheres to requires the disclosure of statements under the Statement of Economic Interests. And then the State Bar Rules of Procedure, Rule 2201, actually require that the additional disclosures under Rule 2201, which relates to relationships that individuals may have with California licensed attorneys, those are kind of the two mandates. Aline, would you add anything about enforcement?
Sure. I think Elizabeth covered it. I want to confirm that these are mandated reportings already. And if there is a failure to report, for example, failure to file a Form 700 or appropriately report financial interest that should be reported, there are mechanisms that are already in place for making appropriate referrals to FPPC. That is the state enforcement agency. We obviously have processes internally to provide individuals with an opportunity to cure, and that is contemplated and allowed by the Political Reform Act. And then we do have mechanisms to take appropriate actions. And our employees, could face disciplinary actions up to termination for failure to appropriately report or file the Form 700s.
Super helpful. Thank you for that education. I just wanted to make sure we had some mechanism, but thank you for that.
Sure.
And thank you for the question and thank you for the response. Very clear, question and response. I will say that I'm pleased to hear that some of the measures that the board took in terms of deciding to, report trustees' compliance has yielded 100% participation by trustees, because I think that's absolutely important. We have to set the standard as trustees, and if the standard that we want is 100% compliance with the requirement, it's on us. And I'm just very pleased that was reported at the at our last meeting.
I wanted to take a moment, Mark, just to recognize Elizabeth. Elizabeth is our one-woman compliance shop at the State Bar, and I just think she's done a tremendous job organizing, using one of Steve Mazur's favorite words, wrangling the 2201 and Form 700 process. And we now have well-documented internal policies and compliance checks, so a big kudos to her is owed.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's terrific. I know it's not easy to do that. And I love the term wrangling, because it's well, I'm sure that's what it takes. And I also believe that most people who are behind are not behind for malicious reasons, but just people get busy. I know how hard the employees at the State Bar work. And sometimes things slip through the cracks and people need reminders. I know I need reminders myself. So that is my presumption. But nonetheless, working to that 100% compliance is where we're at. And I'm pleased to hear that Elizabeth is moving that. So thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you, Leah, for letting us know.
And in terms of next steps for this meeting, I think the remaining two items are action items. The approval of the audit and the approval of the PTL report. So we were wondering, Aline and I, Trustee Tony, if you would like, could adjourn this meeting to another date. And one option is the board meeting. So we have the 16th and the 17th, we do have, for example, I know, knowing you that you won't like this, but we have a lunch break scheduled on the 16th that could be used as a time certain for audit, to at least hear those two items. The audit itself is on the full board agenda as well. So we could potentially bypass the audit committee this year because we couldn't achieve quorum and take up the audit with the full board only. That would still leave the PTL report for approval, but that is not necessarily time sensitive. So a couple of options for you to consider, or we could pick a whole nother day altogether.
Look, I really appreciate you helping with options. You know, this is my first cycle serving as chair of the audit committee. So let me tell you what I will propose, and I want to hear then from the trustees that are here what they think. So I think two things we absolutely need, I think. I mean, here are the choices. Either we, like you say, recess this to a time certain, and if the available time slot is lunchtime, then I would say that's certainly one option. You know, on the Thursday. You know what the date is. It's not in my head, but whatever date that is, maybe the 16th. Or it has to be taken off the consent agenda and made a regular agenda on the board meeting itself, which, you know, we can do. Things can be moved on the spot from a consent to a regular. But one of those two things has to happen, in my
Right.
view. And I'd like to hear from Trustee Huser and Trustee Barahona. What are your thoughts on moving forward?
Well, I like the idea of just bypassing the separate audit committee discussion and having a full board audit discussion of the audit itself. That makes a lot of sense. And then I think the remaining agenda items are, you know, relatively minimal, so we could get through in a, you know, a short period of time, or continue for a later date if they're not time sensitive. So I like the idea of taking 15 minutes or half an hour of the lunch break and doing it then.
Are you saying as the audit committee or just the whole board should do it at this point? I want to be clear what you.
Well, I think the full board do the review of the audit, so that agenda item, and then there were a couple of other audit committee items I think we still haven't covered in today's meeting because we didn't have a quorum. And we could take 15 minutes or half an hour as the audit committee during lunch and try to cover those then. Lunch during the full board meeting, but convene as an audit committee.
Got it.
Thank
Thank you.
that made sense.
Yeah, it does now. That I was asking only so I understood properly. Trustee Barahona, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Trustee Huser, I could totally support that. I think that makes a ton of sense. Going forward.
Love the idea. And if we can get a little support, I do think that what it requires is, I would say if this were on the full agenda, I would say it needed a minimum of 30 minutes because that's 10 minutes for presentation. And there are some questions I know I have provided them to Elizabeth so that some of those questions will be able to be pre-responded to, maybe some of them, and some of them will go much quicker. So I do think we need at least half an hour to 45 minutes for the full board, because there may be more questions because it's a bigger body, quite frankly. So I know, Leo, you're working with the chair on the mechanics of the agenda. so.
I think it will be fine. I think we may want to plan to do it on Friday.
That's okay.
And we'll have to obviously try to make sure the external auditors are available then, but I think it'll be fine. We don't actually have a very full board agenda. There's plenty of time, is what I'm saying, to take care of it. So I think what we're doing is we're adjourning this meeting to May 16th, maybe at 12:10.
Yeah,
And there we'll take up the consent agenda for the audit committee. I think all of those things are action items. And we will take up the public trust liaison report.
yeah,
And then the full board, we will take up the audit.
yeah. And in the committee meeting, we can take up the minutes, shouldn't take that much time.
Right. Yep. Okay, Elizabeth, Aline, does that work?
Sure, for the record, so the meeting is being adjourned to 12 o'clock on May 16th. To 12 o'clock on May 16th to take about 30 minutes and to address the action items remaining on the agenda.
Trustee Stevens just texted me that he just landed. And so he's able to join by Zoom. He's good. He can try to join by his phone. So timing is everything. So I think that's your call, Chair. He just texted me now.
Well, I suppose if he actually can join in the next few minutes, we probably have the time. And that's always been the plan. Would that be okay with you, trustees? You think he'd
Yes,
be on in the next 5 minutes? I don't want to wait for half an hour for him to join, is what I'm saying.
yeah, just for disclosure, I have a hard stop at 12:30, but I can join until then.
Thank you for letting me know. I appreciate it.
Okay, I just asked him.
I will plan accordingly. Here's what I will say. We might as well give ourselves a little break since we're waiting for him. Let's say we will take a recess, reconvene at 12 o'clock. If he's on, we'll continue. And if he's not, we will adjourn until May 16. How does that sound to people? Okay,
That sounds perfect. Thanks for being so flexible.
it is, we got to do what we got to do. So if there's no objections, let's take a break till 12 o'clock.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Welcome, Stephen. Very happy to see you.
Gotta change my, hang on, my apologies, folks, I just landed.
Yes, well, thank you very much. We're very pleased to see you. Are we ready to go back on the record?
Yes.
All right, well, let's reconvene. All right. We are reconvening after recess. the Audit Committee of the State Bar Board of Trustees. Welcome back. I would like to know how the, I want to have it recorded that Trustee Stevens has joined, and I would like a confirmation that that the quorum has been achieved.
Yeah, we can take a roll call vote and then we can establish a quorum.
Perfect. Barahona,
Present?
Buenaventura, Chen, Huser,
Present.
Stevens,
We didn't almost hit it.
Stevens. Yes, present. Tony,
Present.
quorum is established.
Thank you very much. Do appreciate it. Let us see what we can, given the time, I will say that the most important thing is the audit. I actually would like to start with the audit, because there are other things we can do much quicker and if necessary, when we reconvene in a short period of time. So, are we prepared for a brief audit report and then we can go to some questions?
Yeah, I think the RSLE joining.
Very good. Welcome, Araceli. Welcome.
Hi, good afternoon. Committee members, Annie's there, perfect.
Yep.
So I'm gonna kick off this audit agenda, which is the audit results of our 2023 financial statement audit, which includes the mandatory, the schedule of mandatory fees, as well as the annual legal service trust fund report. We do have a presentation. I think this is the first year that the audit committee is meeting Annie. Previously it was David Bullock, who was the presenter for NGO for a couple of years. This year, MGO rotated their partners to get, a fresh set of eyes. And Annie Louie, who's here, she's the audit partner at MGO, who's going to be doing most of the presentation, since this is supposed to be, the external auditors presenting the results to the Finance Committee. I also wanted to introduce you to Coco Zhang, if you have not met her before. She's the controller, in my right hand with anything having to do with the accounting and the GL. So she's going to also help me co-present. So I'm just going to kick it off really quick and share my screen.
Thank you. Welcome, Annie. I will say that we have a hard stop at 12:30, so we're going to ask for a brief overview and then open it up to questions. So whatever you can do to help us out, I'd appreciate.
Can everyone see my screen in the correct format?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so I will move on. So now I'll kick it off to Coco, who's going to do just a brief overview from the State Bar side, and then we'll kick it over to Annie.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Coco from the Office of Finance. It's my pleasure to be here today. In today's presentation, I will be going over some brief backgrounds of the financial audits and some financial result at the end of the 2023. Then I will hand it over to Annie, as introduced by Araceli, the MGO audit partner, and she will continue with the discussion of the audit results and other required communication to the committee. Regarding the backgrounds, the audit committee has oversight responsibility related to the audit processes, including the financial audit. When the audit is completed, the committee will review the audit result, if any, and also if any finding or recommendation. So MGO was re-engaged in 2023 to be the State Bar's independent auditors for the 2023 audit. And there was a change in 2023 regarding the State Bar's statutory submission deadline of its financial report to the state legislature and the Supreme Court. Now is May 31st as opposed to April 30th in the past. And the packet of the audit report was prepared by the Office of Finance, and all reporting period for those report are from like January 1st to December 31st, 2023, which is the state bar's fiscal year. There were 4 reports submitted for review. First of all, the basic financial statement was prepared by the Office of Finance, including the MD&A, financial statement notes, and the required supplementary information. Also, Finance prepares the statement of expenditure of the mandatory fee in compliance with the CALR standard. And in the meantime, the Office of Assets and Inclusion prepared the Legal Services Trust Fund program report in accordance with the Business and Profession Code 6210 to 6228. And Finance coordinated with OAI to finalize and submit the report as part of the audit report package. The 4th report, which is the report to the Audit Committee at the board, was prepared by MGO, and Annie will go over that in more details. So moving on to the next slide, I will going to provide an overview of the state bar's financial position at the end of 2023 at a high level. Total assets increased by 162 million compared to 2022, was mainly due to the significant increase in the client trust account revenue, resulting from the higher account balances, and the 2023 interest rate remained high and for the whole year. And with more revenue came in that the cash and investment, the state bar have as at the end of 2023 that has increased significantly. And in the meantime, the net capital asset also increased by about 17 million. The state bar sold its San Francisco building in November 2023 and leased it back subsequent to the sale. And which, like, according to the GASB 87, the lease accounting standard, the state bar recorded 51 million lease assets and the related lease liability. And in addition, in 2023, the state bar implemented another new GASB standard and related to subscriptions. So subscription assets and the related subscription liability were first recorded in 2023 in state bar's financial statement. So on the liability side, as mentioned, according to the lease standard, the state bar recorded the lease liability and increased by 50 million. And state bar also paid off like 2 loans related to the San Francisco building that decreased the loans payable by about 19 million. Another significant change was related to the net pension liability. It increased by 11 million, was mainly based on the CalPERS actuarial variation at the end of the fiscal year for the state bar, and also depending on different assumptions, experiences, and the performance in the plan. Overall, the net position for the state bar increased by 113 million, mainly due to the trust account revenue, as mentioned, and the change in the net position represents the revenue over expenses, and we can take a look at more information in this slide. The total operating revenue increased by 135 million, and mainly due to the trust account revenue mentioned previously. And in the meantime, the grant revenue also increased due to the state bar administer new grants in 2023, such as the homeless prevention grant, HP4, and the consumer debts and the care code grants. On the operating expenses side, it increased by 38 million. Due to the increase in expenses related to various programs, one significant change was related to the OCTC due to the new position for the office. Other than that, the grants expense also increased by 22 million. As mentioned, there were new grants and also more grant revenue were distributed in the year. So this highlights only for some significant items in different financial categories and do not include like all captions in our financial statement. You can always refer back to our detailed report for more information and analysis. And this concludes the first part of the presentation. Unless anyone has questions at this moment, we will turn it over to Annie to continue with the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you for that, Coco. My name is Annie Louie. I'm the engagement partner for this year's external audit for the State Bar. I have a pretty short presentation, and since a lot of the good information was already shared by Coco, I will try to be brief and I'll focus more on the audit aspect of the process. So if you will please go to the next slide. I do want to mention that our scope of services actually includes 5 different deliverables, 4 of which is being presented to the Audit Committee today. The single audit, which is an audit for compliance with federal awards, is still in process. We're very close to completion, but that is not part of today's presentation. So I did want to highlight that. Next slide, please. In terms of the auditor's responsibilities, I do want to highlight what we're engaged to do because it is important to understand the responsibility of the external auditor as well as those of management. And all of this is included in more details in our engagement letter. So this is an overview of the respective responsibilities. As the external auditor, we were engaged to provide an audit opinion on the financial statements of the State Bar, as well as compliance in terms of the examinations that we perform on the two other reports that were presented today, that are being presented today. Excuse me. We conducted our audits in accordance with AICPA standards, generally accepted auditing standards, as well as government auditing standards. And that is required because the State Bar had received federal awards. So we have to perform the audits in accordance with government auditing standards, which is a little bit more stringent in terms of independence guidance that are required of the auditors, as well as some of the reporting requirements that we have to go through. As part of our audit processes, we do consider internal controls in relation to compliance as well as for financial reporting. But do want to emphasize that we're not engaged to provide an opinion on internal controls over financial reporting or on compliance. But in the course of the audit, if we do have any observations or findings, deficiencies that we note in internal controls, we would include that as part of our audit reports. Next slide, please. I know this is a lot to take in. Again, more details is included in the engagement letter. I won't read this word by word, but this highlights management's responsibilities. Basically, management makes management decisions and takes ownership of the financial statements that are presented in front of you. Something that I highlight in this slide is towards the bottom. In terms of Audit Committee, we look to you as the governing body to provide oversight of the financial reporting process and in relation to considerations of fraud over financial reporting and having proper control with compliance as well. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides highlights the audit results. This is an overview of the same information that is included in the report to the board. The auditor's report is first thing off the bat, we did provide an unmodified opinion on the financial statements, and that is the highest level assurance that you can achieve under a financial statement audit. We also provided unmodified opinions on the examination reports as well. One thing I do want to admit is the basic financial statements that are included in your packet did have an oversight. It did not include the auditor's report. That was an oversight, but I do want to let you know that we have a modified opinion for that. And I'll be happy to share a screen of that if you would like me to do so at the end of the presentation. In terms of internal control deficiencies, I'm happy to report that we have noted none that are considered deficiencies. In our report to the board, we did have one recommendation and observation that we've made for improvement in the process, but that is not considered a deficiency in controls. In terms of significant accounting policies and practices, Coco had mentioned in her presentation that there were a number of statements that were implemented by the State Bar this year. So this is a highlight and summary of those. There weren't any significant impact as a result of those implementations. So I'm also happy to report that we did not find any exceptions in regards to those items. Going forward to the next slide. This is a list of the significant accounting estimates that were required as part of the financial statement preparation process. As you know, the preparation does require accounting estimates based on management's judgment at the time of the preparation on what is likely to happen in relation to these areas that are covered. The process used by management encompasses their knowledge and experience about past and current events and certain assumptions that are made about future events. We did perform a series of procedures, including analyticals, as well as tested controls, or excuse me, tested details regarding the estimates and the input that went into those estimates. And we were able to determine that the estimates were considered reasonable in relation to the financial statements as a whole. Moving on. This is the typical items that you will see in the report to the board or management letter. I am happy to report that there are no matters to report, which is basically no news is good news when it comes to these items. The one thing that I would like to highlight in terms of financial statement disclosures is the pension and OPEB benefits. As you know, these are pretty large balances and they require a lot of estimation involving an actuarial evaluation in the process of preparing the estimates as well as the required disclosures. The other significant event, of course, as mentioned, is the sale and leaseback of the San Francisco office building during the year. Okay. Moving on, please. Lastly, I'd just like to close out with what's to come. There are a good number of accounting updates in terms of GASB standards that have been issued that will be applicable to the State Bar in the next 2 years. So this is going through 99, 100, 101, and 102. In the coming week, maybe a couple of weeks, if that, 103 will be issued as well, and that is a significant change to the financial reporting model. So I just want to mention that because we didn't get to include it as of the date of the materials, but we are expecting another GASB to be released in a couple of weeks. This concludes my presentation. I will be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Would you put on the screen quickly the management letter?
I'm trying to share my screen.
Thank you.
Let me see. Let me know when you do see it.
Not yet. I see something happening.
Is it loading?
Yes, it looks
Okay.
like you see something.
It says I'm sharing. Is this the report you have in mind?
The management letter. I don't know if it's the management letter or not.
This is our report to the board. It is commonly known as the management letter, where we report on the information regarding the audit processes.
Right. So this we did not receive yet, correct?
No, it should be part of your packet.
It is part of the agenda, Mark. I think if you may have been referring to the financial statement audit opinion, that it should have been included, but it was not. And it's just the one pager, similar to the other opinions that you saw in the other two reports. That's what I think you were referring to, Mark.
I don't recall seeing this document in our packet.
This one is page, give me a second. Page.
It's attachment D, and it should be page 118 of 132.
Thank you, Annie.
Okay, thank you. I missed that. Thank you. I stand corrected. So I'm going to open it up for questions from the trustees, and then I have several that I'd like to point out and ask about. So we'll start with Trustee Huser and Trustee, we can take this off the screen for now, and Trustee Barahona. And Trustee Stevens, of course.
I just had two questions on the financial statements themselves. First one was on page 8. I just wanted you to verify that I'm reading this appropriately. The net unrestricted funds are a negative 43.6 million. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes, it's a negative amount.
And then apologies, I forgot to write down the page number, but I believe it's page 9, the total pension ads were 281% above what they were last year, and that was to, fund an additional part of the unfunded pension requirement. Is that right?
Let's take a look at that.
I interpreted that number to be the increase in the unfunded liability, but maybe I'm wrong too.
Yeah, well, maybe you guys can tell me what it is.
I saw the same thing, Trustee Huser, and glad you're asking.
So from 22 to 20, okay, so I think this is comparing, okay, so the MD&A compares, we compared 23 to 22 as well as fiscal year 22 to 21. I think if I'm reading your question correctly, Mary, the 281% is the net pension liability increase from 2021 to 2022.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's the net liability, or that's the net funding of the liability? It sounds like it's the first one.
The net pension liability.
Got it. Thank you.
The net pension liability itself, yes.
Very good questions, and I want that because it's on page 13 of 132 to be noted in the agenda, in the minutes, that we need to follow this trend because we don't want the trend to continue to increase. That's very serious. And thank you very much, Trustee Huser. Trustees, Barahona, Stevens? If not, I'll get into a couple questions.
I don't have a question, but I just a congratulations on the unmodified opinion. I know folks work all year for that. And the internal controls necessary to achieve that. So I was quite pleased in seeing that and not seeing any significant deficiencies. So I know audits, there's a lot of great questions coming your way, but I'm really pleased on the direction and all the work that it takes to get to that. So just congratulations to you and your team, Araceli. It's really wonderful work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Cook oversaw a lot of it, so I owe it to her and the team as well. They deserve credit.
And I want to second that because I noted on page 4 that it identified 2 findings, significant deficiency findings that were corrected. So that is a huge accomplishment. I also appreciate the note that any costs incurred by members of the Board of Trustees that exceed those authorized by the policy are not reimbursed and paid for out of pocket by trustees. That is what I asked for. Thank you very much for including that. One of my big concerns is that if you just look at the big numbers, it looks like the state bar is flush with cash. There is no financial problem. You don't see a financial problem until you get to page 71, where we talk about the operating loss, okay? And I wish there was a way to, in the management letter, to say something about that, to point that out, to say that, gosh, the state bar has no deficiencies, has been running, and has been a effective steward of all this money that we don't control, okay? And that there's a concern that our ability to do that is undermined by an operating loss, which may mean we can't keep the employees we need to live up to this level. If there's any way to, A, move up this operating loss from page 71 to earlier in this audit report, and to note it in the management letter that, it is that when you look at it, those are the staff people running the operation and managing the money and doing a good job. But if we start losing employees because, so any comment on that? Is that something you can do?
Let me share my thoughts, and then maybe Annie, you can chime in as to what can be done on the management letter side, if anything. So, the financial statements are presented on a consolidated basis. So it is true when you look at our P&L or our income statement, it looks like we have a lot of money. Even our cash, right? The reality is that most of that belongs to the restricted grants funds.
Exactly.
Right. And that's the problem. But we have to present it on a consolidated basis on the face of the financials, your balance sheet, income statement, et cetera. It looks like we are a healthy organization, but unfortunately, most of that money is restricted and it's not available to be used by the general fund. Once you get to page 71, that's where we're presenting again, the balance sheet and the income statement by fund, and that's where you can see the general fund, which is the first fund we present, has a significant loss of almost $20 million. I think in terms of the financial statements themselves, it has to be kept in this format, but I don't know, Annie, if in the letter there's something that can be added to address this.
But
Or
isn't
any
that what I
recommendation?
referred to on page 8, which is the net unrestricted funds of the negative 43.6 million? Is that the same? That's the consolidated net unrestricted? Because I think Trustee Tony, that was what I was pointing out too, is that the unrestricted is a negative.
Right.
That's how I read that, at least.
Good point. I think you might be on mute, Annie. We want to be able to hear.
I don't want to interrupt, but I want to note that it looks like Trustee Stevens has dropped off. We're waiting to see if he's able to rejoin. So there's no longer a quorum.
Okay. Well, let's hear the answer anyway.
Okay. So in terms of the presentation, the State Bar is required to present your financial statements in an enterprise fund format and the consolidated format. So to Secretary Sally's point, you do have to present it in that format. The program fund financial statements that are in the back of the packet here, they are provided to provide more information in a more detailed level about the State Bar's operations. And you notice they're called program funds versus funds that stand on its own, because there are very strict guidelines and requirements on what is considered a fund under the GASB standards. So from the State Bar's perspective as a whole, you do have the consolidated financial statement, which is what we opine on. I completely understand the point of, how you should be looking at available funding to fund operations versus the restricted funding to fund the purposes for which the revenues were raised for. And in a way, the net position categories of the net investments in capital assets, which represents amounts that cannot fund operations because they are invested in capital assets for operations of the bar. The restricted for specified purposes under the net position category shows you monies that are legally restricted for their respective purposes. And if you go through the notes, the disclosures, the financial statements, that's when you go into details of what they are restricted for, to give more information to the users about what such funds can be spent on. The unreserved is everything that is left. And to the comments that have been made, it is currently negative, largely because the long-term liabilities for your net OPEB obligations and your net pension liabilities is a big number. So for that long-term perspective, you do have a negative net position for the unrestricted portion. As part of the audit process, should I pause for questions?
My main question is, can you, in the management report, have a note that makes this a little bit more clear for someone who isn't going to spend time, a couple hours with the audit, but will probably spend a couple minutes?
Right, so let me get to that. So as part of the audit process, what we do have to do is to consider going concern. And that is an outlook of whether ongoing operations will be funded at least for a year out. So that is what we consider. If, let's just say that, as part of the analysis that is done by management and our review of such analysis, we do think that there is a risk that operations will not be funded, at least for the year outlook, we will have to mention that in the audit report. And if it is more likely than not that we're looking at, let's just say a bankruptcy situation, there is a different set of auditing and accounting requirements that we would have to report under. So that would be
Annie, I'm gonna interrupt you just because I know Trustee Heiser has to leave. We've had a lot of trouble reaching quorum. And I think if we want to vote on this, we need to do it soon. I'm not sure you're answering Mark's very specific question, which is whether you can move a particular statement into your management letter. I think it's a yes or no answer.
The short answer is no, because we don't opine on the individual program funds that are in the back of the financial statements. We opine on consolidated.
I think Trustee Tony, to achieve your end, we should focus on our communication around the release of this audit.
Okay.
It sounds like we are not going.
On the cover letter. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
Look,
it could go in the deck that we just went through. I mean, it could go in there. It doesn't have to go in the opinion itself, but it could just be highlighted there, couldn't it?
Sure.
The place I would recommend such discussion is in the MD&A.
So I would entertain a motion to, I don't know if you need to put it on a screen, just to make it official and clear, to approve the audit and to transmit it to the bodies we're supposed to transmit it to. I think it's probably the Supreme Court and the legislature, but it'll be here, yes. Do I have a motion to adopt it?
I'll move.
Trustee Heiser moved. Do I have a second?
Second.
Trustee Barahona. I'm gonna ask for a roll call.
Barahona,
Aye.
Buenaventura is not present. Heiser,
Aye.
Stevens, Tony,
Aye. We'll see if we can try Stevens one more time.
Stevens,
He is on the phone as a panelist. Let me see.
Yeah, I think on this kind of thing, we actually need a verbal when it comes to a vote. I actually think that's probably required.
He's saying aye. He's not muted. I wonder what's the issue.
We're gonna have Aileen tell us what to do in this situation.
Who is he saying aye to?
He's texting me saying, I'm saying aye, but you can't hear me. I'm unmuted. I don't know if there's a settings issue that we have on Zoom because he's participating by phone. I'm not sure.
It looks
Is
like he
there-
has permission to talk. So
Okay, can somebody give him permission to talk? If not, I think we could accept it, but.
he does have permission to speak.
But he says he's speaking and we can't hear him. So it sounds like a tech
Okay.
problem. Oh, is
Can you
that?
confirm from him? Okay, if you're confirming that he is acting.
No,
He said
he's
aye.
talking.
He said
heard
aye.
him.
Heard
Okay.
enough.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
now okay.
Aye, aye.
Okay, 4 ayes, 0 noes, the motion carries.
Excellent. I still think we need to adjourn to May 16th at 12 o'clock to take care of the remaining pieces of business.
Okay.
And does that sound okay? Is there anything else before we adjourn?
Really quick, Mary, to answer your question, that I just want to address it. The unrestricted negative 40 million, it's primarily comprised of the general fund, but it does include other funds. It's consolidated, but most of it is the general fund. I just wanted to answer that really quick.
Thank you, Araceli. Hey, thank you everybody for joining the trustees, and special shout out to Trustee Stevens for moving mountains to be here. I appreciate all of the staff, all the presenters for being here. Thank you very much. We are adjourned until May 16th at 12 o'clock. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.